Grace and peace to you. My name is Paul Dezay. I'm the pastor of Sandy Hook United Methodist Church. It's good to be with you today. Today's Wednesday, Old Testament day. We're in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 21 to 31. So the way this works is we're preparing our hearts for Sunday. And Sunday is if I remember correctly, the fifth Sunday after the Epiphany. And we will be reading the scriptures for this coming Sunday's Revised Common Lectionary. And we read the Gospel on Monday, the New Testament on Tuesday, the Old Testament on Wednesday, and the Psalm on Thursday. And then Friday, we find the themes, the threads, the intersections that run through the four passages. So today we're in Isaiah 40, verses 21-31. Now there's a familiar verse in this passage. It's the raises us up on eagle's wings. We won't grow weary and tired. So that passage, that verse is familiar to us, but there's a bigger story going on here that provides the context for us to understand that verse. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This is Isaiah 40. It's the first chapter of the second section of Isaiah. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah take place before the exile. Chapters 40 to 55, which this is what this section is about what's going on during the exile. And then 56 to the rest of the book is about what takes place after the exile when they've returned back to Jerusalem. And so we're talking about the exile. Exile is this understanding that the Israelites, their city has been destroyed, their temple has been destroyed, they've been carried off to live in the enemy land, and they feel deserted. They feel like God has deserted them. So that's the context here. The first thing that we see is repeated questions by Isaiah, and it's this verse number 21 and verse number 28. Let me find it real quick. Verse number 21 says, "Don't you know? Haven't you heard? Wasn't it announced to you from the beginning? Haven't you understood since the earth was founded?" And then the line of questioning is asked again in verse number 28. And so what Isaiah is saying is that the Israelites have amnesia, like a theological amnesia. They forget who God is. They forget who they are. And oftentimes that surfaces in the midst of tragedies and storms. We forget that God's been with us in the past, that God has rescued us, that God has saved us. And we forget that. And almost looks like we start over in the midst of the storm, like, God, are you there? And so the psalmist or the Isaiah is asking that question. It says, don't you already know this? Don't you already know that God has been with you from the beginning? And so theological amnesia. And then it's really easy for us to forget about God when things are going well. It surfaces in the midst of crisis, but when things go well, we forget that God's with us and that he calls us to something. The second thing that stood out to me is Isaiah is reminding these people in exile that God is in charge. That God is in charge. It might appear because Babylon is in charge, and Babylon has defeated Jerusalem, and Babylon has destroyed the temple and the city, that Babylon's in charge, Nebuchadnezzar's in charge. But the reality is that God is in charge. And there's verses here, starting in verse number 22. God inhabits the earth's horizons. Its inhabitants are like locusts or grasshoppers. Stretches out the skies like a curtain and spreads it out like a tent for dwelling. God makes dignitaries useless and the earth's judges into nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely is their shoot rooted in the earth. And then when God breathes on them and they dry up, the windstorm carries them off like straw. So to whom will you compare me? And who is my equal, says the Holy One. God's in charge. And then the third thing that stood out to me is it's when we're weak, when we're tired, when we're at the end of the rope, then we're vulnerable enough to have God raise us up on eagle's wings. We have God, we're vulnerable enough for God to give us the strength and to take care of us. And so exile is this season when they remember that God is with them, even in the midst of the valley. And in the midst of their weakness, in the midst of their remembering, God raises them up. And as we do know, that God rescues them and sends them back to Jerusalem. So vulnerability is an important part of the journey of being with Christ. It's when we're weak that we discover that we're strong, right? And so in the midst of your weakness, in the midst of our weakness, we find vulnerability. We remember that God has been faithful, and then God raises us up. Just like Jesus lifted up Peter's mother-in-law, raised up, resurrection in the midst of her fever. And that's what God does to us. So that's what I came up with this week or today in the passage. If you would share your thoughts in the comments, and then we'll be back tomorrow for Psalm 147. Hope you have an amazing day. Grace and peace to you.